In ancient Rome, your father wasn't just your parent. He was your owner. And if he wanted you dead, the law said yes. This was not exaggeration. Not rumor whispered through ancient streets. It was the cold letter of Roman law. The concept was called patria potestas, the power of the father, and it meant that one man held the lives of his entire family in his hands. Sons, daughters, grandchildren, even wives lived under his shadow, and their survival depended entirely on his will. The father was judge, jury, and executioner inside the household. If he ordered a child killed, it was not murder. If he sold his son into slavery, it was not crime. If he abandoned a newborn to die, it was not tragedy in the eyes of Rome. It was simply his right. For the Romans, the empire of marble and law, the most terrifying tyranny, did not come from emperors or armies, but from the man sitting at the head of your table. The Romans had a word for this nightmare: patria potestas, the power of the father. It was not symbolic, not a gentle idea of family leadership, but absolute legal domination. Under this law, a Roman father was more than a parent. He was a sovereign, a ruler within the four walls of his home. His children were not considered fully independent beings. They were his property, bound to his authority until the day he died. No matter how old they were, with a word, he could sell his son into slavery, strip him of inheritance, or disown him entirely, erasing him from the family's name as if he had never existed. With a command, he could order his daughter married against her will, or abandoned at birth to die in the cold night air outside the city. And if he judged a child guilty of dishonor, theft, or simple disobedience, he could execute them. Not secretly, not in shame, but openly, with the full weight of Roman law standing behind him. There were no courts of appeal, no neighbors to intervene, no cries for justice. The state itself stepped aside, declaring that the father's will was final. This was the terrifying truth of Rome's most civilized law. The empire that prided itself on order and justice gave every father the power of life and death over his own blood. In Rome, children were not born into freedom. They were born into ownership. The moment a baby entered the world, its life balanced on a knife's edge, and the one who decided its fate was the father. The infant was laid at his feet. If he bent down and lifted the child into his arms, it was accepted into the family. If he turned away in silence, the baby was cast out. Infanticide was not a crime in Rome. It was expected. Unwanted children, especially baby girls who could not carry the family name, or disabled infants, seen as weak burdens, were taken outside the city walls and left to die of exposure. Some were abandoned at rubbish heaps, their tiny bodies scavenged by wild dogs. Others were collected by slavers and raised to be sold. A child had no protection from this fate. The law did not recognize them as independent beings with rights or humanity. They were property, no different than a slave, a farm animal, or a piece of land. They could be given away, traded, or destroyed at will. Survival in ancient Rome often began not with love, but with luck, the luck that a father decided you were worth keeping. The power of the Roman father stretched even further than his children. It reached into the lives of wives. A woman in Rome never truly belonged to herself. As a daughter, she lived under her father's absolute authority. When she married, that authority could transfer to her husband. But in many cases, her father's shadow still lingered, binding her legally to his will. A Roman marriage was less about love than it was about alliances, wealth, and power. Fathers arranged unions to strengthen political ties or gain financial advantage, trading daughters like currency. The young bride had no voice in the matter. She could be handed to a stranger decades older than her, all with the cold approval of Roman law. Even within marriage, her fate could still rest in her father's hands. He could force her to leave her husband if it served his ambitions, or strip her of her dowry to advance his own status. In the most brutal cases, he could even dissolve her marriage, sell her into servitude, or have her discarded entirely if she became inconvenient. For Roman women, the figure of the father was inescapable, a looming reminder that in this world, they were not people with choices, but pawns moved by the will of men. Even in marriage, a wife lived in fear that her father's command might outweigh her husband's protection. In Rome, the father's authority wasn't symbolic. It was blood-soaked and terrifyingly real. Roman history gives us chilling examples of men who used their legal right to kill their own children, not in secret, but openly, with the approval of society. One father named Aulus Fulvius executed his own son for conspiring with Catiline, the rebel who sought to overthrow the Republic. The boy was barely more than a youth, swept up in politics. But Fulvius saw disobedience, betrayal, and weakness. So he ordered the boy's death with his own command, preferring to slaughter his son than let him lie dishonored. Another infamous case tells of a father who caught his daughter drinking wine, an act considered scandalous for Roman women. His punishment: death. In the eyes of the law, her sip of wine was enough to justify her execution, because a father's judgment was absolute. Even generals weren't safe from this horror. Titus Manlius, a Roman consul, once executed his own son for disobeying orders in battle, even though the boy had won a duel and saved Roman honor. To Manlius, obedience mattered more than life itself. He became a legend, not for mercy, but for butchering his child in the name of discipline. These weren't whispered crimes hidden in shame. They were public lessons, celebrated as examples of Roman virtue fathers who chose iron discipline over blood ties. In this world, the home wasn't a refuge. It was a courtroom where your father was judge, jury, and executioner. If Roman children were not killed, they could still be sold. Under the brutal logic of patria potestas, a father could legally turn his own flesh and blood into currency. Sons and daughters were not individuals, they were assets. The law even allowed a father to sell a son into slavery not just once, but multiple times, each time reclaiming him, only to sell him again if the need for money returned. Some of these children were forced into backbreaking labor in mines and fields, never to see freedom again. Others were trained to fight and die as gladiators, their lives gambled away in the sand of the arena. For daughters, the fate was often darker still. Many were sold into prostitution, condemned to lives of degradation, before they were even old enough to understand the crime committed against them. And the most chilling part, none of this was illegal. No court, no senate, no priest would interfere. A father who sold his son into chains was not a monster by Roman standards. He was simply exercising his right. In a world that worshipped power above compassion, a child's body was just another piece of wealth, something to be spent or discarded as the head of the household saw fit. For centuries, the father's word was law, unquestioned and absolute. But as Rome shifted from republic to empire, the sharpest edges of patria potestas began to dull. Scandals and abuses forced emperors to place limits. Small, hesitant restrictions on the most brutal expressions of paternal power. By the late empire, outright executions of children without trial were discouraged, even frowned upon. And yet, the shadow of the old law lingered. A Roman father still stood as judge and jury in his own home, his voice echoing louder than the state's. Even if he chose not to kill, the knowledge that he could was enough. Sons, daughters, wives, they lived beneath a constant, silent threat. The law may have softened, but the fear remained carved into the bones of Roman society. Because in Rome, power was never about whether it was used. It was about the knowledge that it could be. History is dark, and we must remember it